Hi, I'm Rich from Medieval History Buff. Thank you for watching my video, and don't forget to hit like, subscribe, comment and share. When Edward the Confessor died in early 1066, Harold Godwinson nipped in and took the throne, and made himself Harold II. As I have mentioned in previous videos, I believe Edward the Confessor's preferred choice to succeed him as king would have in fact been Harold rather than William, Duke of Normandy. Harold's family had given Edward no little trouble, but Harold himself was unquestionably made of the stuff required to be king. On more than one occasion he had snuffed out trouble for Edward, and it's hard to see why Edward would have made William his heir. And even if what William had said was true, that he had been declared heir in the mid-1050s, then it would have been perfectly reasonable and understandable for Edward to change his mind. He would have known very little about the Norman Duke. Perhaps he had been charmed on a visit to England by William. But Edward would have had genuine first-hand experience of seeing Harold in action. Harold was a fine military leader and also capable diplomatically and when it comes to governance. He was also English, which would have been distinctly preferable to the nobility. Therefore, Harold taking the throne would have seemed natural to Edward the Confessor and most of the population of England, and William's invasion, to me, is really an act of opportunism and would have dire consequences. Harold II, though, didn't just have to worry about William. Harold III, Hardrada of Norway, also had his eyes set on the English throne. He claimed the English crown on the somewhat shaky ground of an agreement that had been reached by the Danish King of England, Harthacnut, in the 1030s. And so Hardrada was the first to invade, aided by Harold II's really rather obnoxious and horrible brother, Tostig. Hardrada defeated one English army before he succumbed at Stamford Bridge to Harold's men. Although Stamford Bridge was 3 weeks before the Battle of Hastings, it certainly aided William's eventual successful conquest. Harold lost around 5,000 men at Stamford Bridge, a significant number, but when news arrived of William's landing at Pevensey, instead of delaying, Harold marched to meet him. The English king would have been much better served biding his time. With his forces physically and mentally drained, his numbers depleted, and with William needing a quick battle, as he only had limited men and resources, and unlike Harold, William was in a foreign land. England was a country he hoped to conquer, but if he engaged in too much pillaging and plundering, this could have been disastrous for William if he did in fact succeed in claiming the English crown. William would not have wanted to have made too many enemies early on. Therefore, he needed a quick battle. Burning and ruining the English countryside would have been no good for William's reputation. But Harold didn't seem to follow this logic, and the two armies met at Hastings on the 14th of October, 1066. Before the battle commenced, William gave his men one last rousing speech, and so effective was his rhetoric that the Normans were said to be boiling with rage. But as pent up with adrenaline and anger as they might have been, the English still held the higher ground, and they were formidably set up defensively to repel wave after wave of Norman attacks. And after so many of these failed assaults, William and his commanders may have been getting disheartened and not a little desperate. But were the Normans desperate enough by this point to retreat? It would have appeared to the English army that they were, and as the Normans appeared to be beginning to withdraw, some of William's knights and their horses came crashing down into a ditch that had been dug as a trap. Men and horses were trampled alike. This chaotic retreat encouraged a number of the English soldiers to follow in order to wreak further havoc on the Normans, but what this had done was create a gap in the English defensive line, which was good news for William. And so I think it's quite likely that this was what William had been planning all along. Although I think it's safe to say that he was not expecting the ditch to cause so much damage to his forces, but he had finally created a gap in the English army that had thwarted him for most of the 14th of October. And as light began to fade on that fateful day, the tide was finally turning in the favour of William the Conqueror. The Englishmen that had broken away from the main English army to follow the feigned Norman retreat soon realised the error of their ways. They had created a gap in the English defensive line, which the Normans were now very much exploiting. And so they had to try and double back to help their aiding comrades, but in doing so, they also came crashing down at the well-hidden ditch. Sensing his advantage, William now turned to his archers to further hinder the English army. He ordered them to change the trajectory of their arrows. Rather than firing straight at Harold's forces, he told them to rain their arrows down from a great height onto the English army. And this tactic was incredibly successful. What it effectively done was create a blanket of arrows which almost blinded the English forces. And many lives were lost by this particular tactic, and it's quite possible that Harold himself was one of the many victims of William's inspired idea. The story goes, famously, that he was struck in the eye. If that is in fact true, then what I have described here is almost certainly how it would have happened. I still think it's more likely that Harold was cut down towards the end of the battle, as his forces by this point were becoming depleted, but it's certainly not out of the question that he was struck in the eye. And so Harold II fell. He fell with his army in disarray. As I mentioned, some of his men had broken away from the main line, only to double back and be killed, and this is what had effectively lost Harold the battle, and had won it for William. Credit has to be given to William if the retreat was in fact a genuine military tactic on his part, and not just cowardice on his men's part. But what William certainly did was take advantage of the situation that withdrawal had created, whether it was genuine or whether it was cowardice, as I just mentioned. So he took advantage of the situation that was developing on the battlefield. So he was showing his military flexibility and his capability for real genius when it comes to taking advantage of a situation like that. when an opening had come for his army to penetrate the English defensive line, he and his men had literally barged their way through it. I still maintain that this was not a battle that Harold II should have lost. And actually, it is more of a case of him and his men losing the battle rather than William winning it. But you still have to give some credit to William for how he has changed the course of the battle. Because if his men had gone into genuine retreat and fled the battlefield, then that would have been his claim to the English throne gone and in tatters effectively. But that's all subjective. And what he done by being so flexible on the day is he effectively turned the tide of history by being able to think on his feet, which was a sign of a great military leader. And he certainly went on to become one of England's most recognisable kings, although his impact on history is questionable, and I have to say I still regard him as a usurper. I think Harold II was a far more legitimate king than he was.